I welcome everyone to Stratford Hall. I'm Karen Daly. It is my absolute privilege to serve as president of this incredible historic place. At a time when most Americans want to learn more about our past and engage in honest conversations about our struggle to build a more perfect union, Stratford Hall Historic Preserve, the home of the Lees of Virginia, provides visitors with an inspiring and immersive experience of life in America's formative years. No other historic venue, I would argue, has so carefully preserved and presented 2,000 acres of natural and human history. The Stratford Hall experience, as many of you know, includes architecture, artifacts, archaeology, and agriculture that act as windows into the everyday lives of the Lee family, of the colonists, of the enslaved community, and of all of those who called this incredible place home for generations. Here at Stratford Hall, we invite visitors to learn from the courageous struggles of our ancestors, taking inspiration both from what they endured and what they accomplished. We thank you all for joining us here at Stratford Hall today, many in person, some online as well, particularly given the wintry weather that was threatening, for our annual Lee Lecture. As most of you all likely know, Robert E. Lee was born here at Stratford on 218 years ago on January 19th of 1807. And it was for that reason that a group of women banded together in 1929 to acquire and restore Stratford to open it to the public. It is an honor for me today to work alongside passionate and dedicated professionals like Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi, who you'll be meeting momentarily, to continue this mission of historic preservation and education set in place by those women almost 100 years ago today. Please join me now to welcome Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi, Stratford Hall's Director of Research in the Jessie duPont Memorial Library, to introduce our speaker for the 2025 Stratford Hall Lee Lecture. Welcome, Gordon.
Thanks. Thank you, Karen. Welcome, everyone. Those of you who are recidivists back here to Stratford Hall, repeat offenders, we love you. Welcome to this magnificent library in which we're standing. January was a significant month in the Lee calendar. Let me go through some of those dates for you to let you know. Declaration signer Francis Lightfoot Lee died on January 11th, 1797. Mark Twain, who was writing under his own name, Samuel Clemens, called Francis Lightfoot Lee, Frank, he was sometimes called Loudon by his brothers, called him a citizen of the best and highest type, one who put self aside to answer the call of the common weal. Twain reckoned that kind of thing was rare in the political rounds of 1894. Frank's older brother, the man who acted as Virginia's voice in proposing independence from Great Britain on June 7th, 1776, and who signed the grand declaration that elaborated that proposal, Richard Henry Lee, was born on January 20th, 1732. Frank and Richard Henry's first cousin and the proprietor of Stratford from 1782 to 1811, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee III came into the world on January 29th, 1756. We have a lot of January babies here at Stratford. And of course, Harry's youngest son, Robert Edward Lee, was born in that house on January 19th, 1807, relocating with his family to Alexandria sometime around his 4th birthday, though Stratford remained a very warm memory for him well into his late life. There's a letter out on the table that you should take a look at after you hear the talk. We choose to commemorate these several births and a death with an annual Lee lecture, typically focused on the period of the American Civil War. So when I was speaking with last year's Lee lecturer and a friend of Stratford, Dr. Stephen Cushman from UVA, we were talking about the best candidate to fill that role this year, and he and I agreed straight away that it could be none other than his own colleague, Dr. Caroline E. Janney, who is the John L. Now III Professor of the American Civil War and Director of the John L. Now Center for Civil War History at the University of Virginia. A graduate of the University of Virginia, she worked as a historian for the National Park Service and taught at Purdue University before returning to Virginia in 2018. An active public lecturer, she's given presentations at locations across the globe. She's a speaker with the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program, and she has appeared on numerous television programs, including the History Channel's Grant and Lincoln. Those are two, because he was saying Grant and Lincoln. Right. She serves as a co-editor of the University of North Carolina Press's Civil War America series and is the past president of the Society of Civil War Historians. She's published 9 books, including Remembering the Civil War, Reunion and the Limits of Reconciliation in 2013, and Ends of War, The Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox, which is the winner of the 2022 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. And I want to pause for just a moment on that prize. The 3-person jury who recommended Ends of War wrote that Dr. Janney, quote, seamlessly blends military, social, and political history, taking readers across the war-torn landscape as individuals and groups of soldiers decide what their next steps will be. By slowing down the pace of the story, Janney brings readers back to those contingent moments when the war's outcome still seemed unclear. The story Janney tells is so compelling that readers may at times forget that they already know the outcome. In short, Janney succeeds in saying something new and important about the Civil War. President of the Gilder Lehrman Institute said simply that Ends of War is, quote, one of the best history books I've ever read. This spring, UNC Press will release Dr. Janney's 10th book, The Second Manassas Campaign. Join me now in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Janney to Stratford Hall.
Sorry, I should have done this sooner. As I tell my students, oh, that's loud. I spend most of my time in the 19th century, so technology is sometimes a bit of a struggle for me. It's not really true, but I tell them that. Thank you to everyone for coming out on this wet, damp day. And thank you especially to Gordon for all he's done in the lead up to this and for inviting me to come back here to Stratford. I'm gonna just kind of talk for a minute while we work on this slide. The notion of not knowing what comes next, I think I take for granted as a historian. And just last week, classes started again at UVA, started last Monday. And I said something that I often think about, but usually don't say out loud. And I reminded my students that we need to stop and pretend that we don't know what comes next. And it's not necessarily easy, because when we study history, we do know what comes next. But I think it's especially important as we think about the aftermath, if it even was the aftermath of the Civil War. How do wars come to an end? We can talk about this right now as we think of the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Thinking about, I said to my husband this morning, is this going to hold? What's going to come next? And if we can do that as we think about the experience of Lee's soldiers on April 9th or April 11th or April 30th of 1865, the past starts to look different. If we can pretend we don't know what comes next, we can try to understand the decisions that people made, the choices that they had, the intense complications that they're working in, and they didn't necessarily see it as the end of their war. When I told my mom the title of the book was going to be Ends of War, my mom, who was an elementary school teacher, said, why do you have an S on it? That's a typo. And I said, no, actually, it's not, because I think there are multiple endings for different people. And so there are any number of things that we might have talked about today to think about where Lee and his army fit in the wrapping up, the ends, the culmination of the American Civil War. But as many different people as experienced it had their own version of what it meant to end the Civil War. But if we're going to talk about the beginning of an end, we should probably situate ourselves in McLean's parlor, April 9th, 1865, when Lee surrendered his army in Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. Since that time, I think all of us probably are guilty of using Appomattox as shorthand We say Appomattox, and we think that we are all in agreement on what that means. It means the end of the Civil War. But as I've just been expressing, it wasn't necessarily the case for those who were living through it. So today, I'd like you to think about Appomattox as a starting point rather than an ending point. And the map before you is showing the myriad ways in which men might have made their way home. Again, there are as many stories that begin at Appomattox as there are men that were there, Union and Confederate, Black and white. And it's also a story of all the people that those men encountered as they marched away from Appomattox. Before we get into their stories, though, I'd like you to keep two things in mind. First, the terms that were agreed upon by Lee and Grant at Appomattox were not a peace treaty. Peace treaties had to be signed by political leaders, not military leaders. Indeed, the war would never witness a peace treaty, and if it had, it would have thrown under the bus the United States arguments that the rebellion, as the United States called it, was legitimate. If they had recognized the Confederacy as another nation state, so there never could have been a peace treaty. The terms signed at Appomattox were the surrender of a single army. Now, it was the single most important Confederate army, but Appomattox was not the legal end of the war. It was only, and I know that I'm saying only as if it's something small, but it was only the capitulation of a single army. Second, equally, if not more important, Grant's terms sent Lee soldiers back to their homes as paroled prisoners of war. Rather than sending them to prisoner of war camps, they were paroled and sent home. For Grant, getting Lee's soldiers home as quickly as possible was key to restoring the Union. It was as practical as it was pragmatic. And as such, on the morning of April 10th, he issued Special Field Orders number 73 that stated, quote, all officers and men of the Confederate service paroled at Appomattox Courthouse who to reach their homes are compelled to pass through the lines of the Union armies will be allowed to do so to pass free on all government transports and military railroads. We're going to come back to this special order in a bit. They would need to show proof of surrender with a parole pass. So this is the pass. It's not just the parole. This is the pass that Lee would ask for on the morning of April 10th when he met with Grant for the last time. He wanted some sort of proof that his men were in fact paroled prisoners of war. And that's where we end up with the 3 different parole passes. How many of you have been to Appomattox Courthouse? Ah, wonderful. If you haven't been, it's a wonderfully restored, recreated village, and you can go see the printing press or a version of it, and you'll notice the different markings on the side. These passes, again, were as practical as they were symbolically important, because it was with this pass that you could get rations from a Union provost marshal, or you could pass on a government steamer or the government railroads in cases where that was even an option. By sending these paroled prisoners to their homes as quickly and as efficiently as possible, Grant hoped that the war would end more swiftly. Again, the largest Confederate army is still in the field at this point. Joseph E. Johnston's army is in North Carolina. And so this is Grant hoping that there will be a domino effect. But these parole passes are absolutely evidence that we need to keep in mind that these men were still paroled prisoners of war. And Grant's other animating factor, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, is to prevent a protracted guerrilla war. It didn't happen, so we discount that it was even an option. But both Grant and Sherman were incredibly worried that it would happen. And so again, he trusted paroled prisoners over unparoled civilians in many ways. So all of this to say that disbanding Lee's army marked the first and most important step in an enormous process of demobilizing all the armies of the Confederacy that was in many ways as important as mobilizing the men in the first place. It involved tens of thousands of men across a vast landscape and proved far more drawn out at the time than people at the time, or I think since, have understood. And it underscored the uncertainty and the unforeseen consequences of disbanding an army during a civil war. It also helps explain why the lost cause took hold so quickly and so deeply from the very beginning. So this afternoon, I'd like to offer you a glimpse into some of the stories of those men who marched away from Appomattox. And I decided that I would do a Virginia soldier. We'll come to him a little bit later. But I wanted to take the story farther afield than just Virginia. So we're going to trace one Mississippi soldier, Private Ransom J. Lightsey. We don't have a picture of Private Lightsey. He was of the 16th Mississippi. And if you can see the small type there on the right, he's number 37 in the list. A 27-year-old Lightsey of Jasper County, Mississippi, had mustered into the Confederate Army in April 27th, formally joining Company F of the 16th Mississippi on May 31st, 1861 at Corinth, Mississippi. His regiment was then sent to Virginia, where it fought under Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns of '62, in the 7 Days, at Second Manassas, and at Antietam. Lightsey would be wounded not far from here, Battle of Fredericksburg, December of '62. But he would rejoin the regiment and fight in the 1864 Overland Campaign and in the trenches around Petersburg. Indeed, he would be one of those men who stayed with the Army of Virginia until the very end, all the way to Appomattox, where he would begin his long journey home. So we're going to follow Lightsey, but we're also going to dip back into other units as we try to trace the many different ways in which men made their way home. For many of Lee's men, in fact, the journey home began even before Appomattox. Those crunching numbers, and if we look at the 60,000 men who were available to Lee on April 2nd of 1865, the men that were in the trenches at Petersburg or in the defenses of Richmond, Lee had available to him about 60,000 men. We look at those that actually surrender at Appomattox that make the rolls, about 23,000 men. We account for casualties along the way, prisoners of war and otherwise. The short version of my math that I'm doing here is that there are about 20,000 men from Lee's army who should have surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse and did not. These are men who dropped out of the ranks on their way, and I'll pause here and say, I don't like calling it the flight to Appomattox or the march to Appomattox, because of course they weren't headed to Appomattox to begin with. They're trying to hook up with Joe Johnston's army. They happened to go to Appomattox because the railroads keep getting cut off, or their passage on the railroad keeps getting cut off. Anyway, 20,000 men who had dropped out of the ranks for a variety of reasons before the surrender even began. But for most of Lee's men, 28,000 is the number that I should have been using. For the 28,000 men who formally surrendered at Appomattox, the day of April 12th, at least for the infantry, the cavalry and artillery had been sent away in the days before, but April 12th marked the day of the formal surrender. This is something that Grant had demanded, had not been the case at Fort Donelson, had not been the case at Vicksburg. But Grant recognized just how significant Lee and his army were, and he did demand a formal surrender parade. After this, they began their way home. The next morning, for example, on April 13th, Captain William Henry Harder and his regiment, the 23rd Tennessee, marched out of Appomattox bound for their homes. Leaving by way of the Lynchburg Road, he and the 63 remaining members of the 23rd Tennessee marched alongside a group of nearly 1,000 other Confederate soldiers bound for their homes in Southwest Virginia and Tennessee. We often think about Appomattox as 2 men heading off in this direction, maybe 5 men heading off in this direction. But this
is a group of 1,000 soldiers marching away from Appomattox, not unlike how they had marched to Appomattox. Later that evening, Harder observed that the Confederates were, quote, now free to go where we liked. But the men had not. They had not broken from the ranks. Instead, on they marched, four abreast, brigade following brigade, regiment after regiment. Now, many rebel soldiers, Confederate soldiers, would leave in pairs or small parties, as Lightsey did on his way to Mississippi. He left with 3 other members of Company F. Most, like Lightsey, left by foot, unless they were lucky enough to secure a horse or a mule. And the diaries that tell of stories home, someone could find a horse, even if it was a broken down, dilapidated horse, they were in business. And we'll talk about one of those soldiers in just a little bit. The great majority, sorry, I won't go there yet. The great majority started due south from Appomattox, heading for the Carolinas, for Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas. Most of these men are heading due south. Some kept to the roads, but others wanted to avoid any encounters with Union soldiers. And so they followed the muddy ravines, the hog trails, or the stream beds, kept off the beaten path. Some headed east toward Burkeville Junction, which was the first working, this is how far the railroad would get to this point. And so we have a misspelled Appomattox here on the map, and you can see heading toward that blue circle. This is where Burkeville Junction was. With their passes in hand, they hope they can go to Burkeville Junction and then take the train. They hope that they can get rations, and they hope that they can take the train that will take them east. Again, trying to make good on Grant's promise from Special Orders number 73. Others headed west toward the Blue Ridge Mountain. Others trekked south toward Danville. Many of them heading to Danville, again, looking for those railroad connections. Closest railroad that they could get to would be Greensboro. And many of them, they get to places like Greensboro, they're able to find a train where the tracks aren't disrupted, and the trains are so full. There are these wonderful images of Confederate soldiers, not just packed inside the boxcars, but riding on top of the boxcars. They might get 20 miles down the track and the tracks are disrupted, and they have to get off and they'll have to walk to the next station. Throughout the Carolinas and into Georgia, they're trying to take trains as much as possible. Lightsey and his 3 companions would not board a train, however, until they reached Selma, Alabama. So they had walked on foot all that way. Indeed, Lightsey's travel included nearly every form of available transportation. Walked to Alabama, by which point he was barefoot. He crossed rivers by canoe. Portions of the trip were by train, and other legs by steamboat. Indeed, a significant number of soldiers headed to the deep south had traveled by steamboat to make their way to places like Savannah and New Orleans. So they would make their way from Appomattox to City Point. They would go to Fort Monroe, where they would get on, again, these government-sponsored, these U.S. Steamers that would carry them down the coast and take them all, again, onto places like Galveston, New Orleans, Savannah, and otherwise. So transportation, finding transportation is one of the many challenges. Another challenge would be finding food. Some of them turned to what remained of the Confederate government. Even though Confederate armies had been hard-pressed to secure enough provisions for its armies, even in mid-April 1865, there were still government stores. There were still places where the commissary agents had managed to gather resources for Confederate soldiers and often for their wives. A day's march south of Appomattox, for example, and again, still with the remnants of his brigade, Major General Brian Grimes of North Carolina came, and he has a division by this point, sorry. They came upon a small country store where nearly 100 paroled men and several local women had gathered. The shop had served as a distribution center for needy soldiers' wives during the war, where they could come and get rations. And the women had arrived earlier that morning to do just that. They had been promised a small lot of meat by the shopkeeper. But the paroled men, who were incredibly hungry by this point, insisted that they would leave all the meat to the women, but they demanded that the owner turn over his store of cowpeas to them. When the shop owner refused, Grimes threatened them. Remember, and maybe you don't remember, so I will share with you, that officers had been allowed to keep their sidearms. So enlisted men had turned over their rifles. But Grimes, like other officers, still had his revolver. And when the store owner says, no, I'm not giving your soldiers anything, Grimes, still acting very much the part of an officer, he's still in uniform. They all are still in uniform at this point, pulls out his gun and demands that, in fact, the storekeeper turn over his provisions. So he's impressing goods from the storekeeper. Store owner finally relents, and there's a scramble among the soldiers. And we know about this because several of them write about it. They write about it in diaries that they kept. They shoved peas in their haversacks in their pockets. They filled empty containers that they found in the store. And one ingenious young soldier pulled off his pants, made them into a sack by tying the legs, put them over his shoulder, kind of crossbody style, and filled them with cowpeas to the extent possible. Off he marched, recalled an amused comrade, with the peas in the forked sack around his neck. So funny stories along the way, but also less funny stories. Again, civilians are going to bear the brunt of this as groups of soldiers come through. Lots of diaries on the home front, women and otherwise talking about their encounters with soldiers as they come through. Sometimes it's a small group of 2 to 3 people. Other times it's 10, 12 men at a time. I am working on a project right now where there's a family living in Amherst County, so not too awful far west of Appomattox. And every day in the diary that's kept, they account for 2 to 3 Confederates coming through and taking whatever provisions they have left. So civilians are bearing the brunt of feeding those soldiers. Lightsey and his companions quickly discovered this as well. They turned to civilians. They realized that the soldiers that are marching ahead of them are cleaning out the countryside. So you were better off if you had been one of the first groups of people to leave Appomattox. If you're following in the wake, you're often in trouble as you're trying to find provisions that are left. Here's Lightsey. He said, we moved out by the right flank for several miles until we passed beyond the line that the paroled army was traveling. Then we came to a house where there was plenty of grub. The old gentleman of the house gave us all he had that we wanted to eat. But the civilian that Lightsey encountered provided even more information, drawing, quote, a diagram of a route that would lead us through a country where provisions were plentiful. The people living on this route were nearly all loyal Confederates. So he's not the only soldier that I came across that talked about someone providing either a physical map, either a drawing of how to go, or would give them lists. So-and-so will be able to provide for you if you go in this direction. Not all civilians, though, were so willing to share. As these soldiers dispersed across the countryside, they encountered both devoted Unionists as well as Confederates who had grown weary of impressment agents and refused to give any more for a cause that they all believed was lost. Again, in diaries, there are lists of people who helped Confederates on the way home, as well as names of people who did not help. And so there's an accounting that's going on here. Lightsey noted that as they crossed the Dan River into North Carolina, they encountered Unionists, including an old man who informed them that, quote, he was very glad the Yankees had whipped them. This older man grudgingly helped Lightsey, but many refused to do so. Indeed, Harder, that I mentioned earlier, that's heading toward East Tennessee, when they get into East Tennessee, they encounter several conflicts with Unionists there. There's a gunfight that ensues again. So one had to be careful what communities one was going into. Near Washington, Georgia, Lightsey and his companions finally found a U.S. post that had provisions to share. This had been another problem. You might show up at Burkeville Station and all the provisions had already been accounted for. And so Lightsey and his men are likewise looking for Union Post along the way. He said they pulled out their paroles and parole passes and received rations. This is Lightsey. We would have fared pretty badly in this country if we had been without provisions. So the struggle to find food along the way. There's another group of Georgia soldiers that, and again, most of them don't have rifles. They can't hunt for the most part. But one of them manages to kill a crow, and some of the men are willing to eat it, but some of the others quip, they literally ate crow, but we were not going to take part in that. So scavenging for food as well. Yet there was also sometimes chaos, sometimes looting. Even in regions sympathetic to the Confederacy, the refusal or even the inability of civilians to provide food led some soldiers to resort to violence, to resort to plundering, just as Union and Confederate officials had feared. Georgian Lieutenant David Champion, for example, and his traveling companions became outraged when a man in the Carolinas refused to accept their Confederate money for corn and bacon. This is Champion. Seeing it was useless to try to trade with him, I ordered the boys to go to his corn crib and smokehouse and get the corn and bacon we needed. We carried the corn to a mill nearby on the creek and ground it and borrowed his washpot to cook the meat in. So sometimes taking whatever they needed. In several instances, Lee's soldiers turned to looting and pillaging cities, at Danville, at Greensboro, and at Charlotte. Indeed, on May 1st, 1865, a mob of Confederate soldiers ransacked Augusta, Georgia, looting the government stores and pillaging a locally owned tobacco shop. The reaction, though, in the city paper was incredibly fascinating to me, though, because the city newspaper used the same logic as Confederate officers such as General Grimes, who believed that the men were due government goods as compensation for their service. The newspaper said that mobs of Confederate soldiers raiding government warehouses could be explained, if not condoned. So they say you shouldn't be looting private stores. The tobacco shop, for example, that was looted, that was beyond the bounds. But Confederate stores, these were supposed to go to the Army in the first place. They said this is the rightful thing. They should be allowed to take whatever is there. Newspapers and civilians alike explained that Confederate soldiers had fought valiantly. They had fought bravely, only to be overwhelmed by superior Northern resources, which is what Lee had said to them in General Orders Number 9. So this part that becomes integral to the lost cause, that they had been overwhelmed by Northern resources, therefore they were entitled to. They could take whatever they wanted from these warehouses. Now, of course, they shouldn't engage in looting and plundering, but it could be explained, it could be rationalized. Many Confederate sympathizers believed it could be forgiven as part of the social contract that implied soldiers, especially those who had stuck it out to the very end, were entitled at least to be fed on their way home. So Lightsey makes his way back to Mississippi by all of those various routes. And of course, Virginia soldiers have a shorter route. Some men walk for 2 days, some of them takes them 2 weeks. But I want to turn to the story of another soldier to highlight some of the other uncertainty that followed at Appomattox. I don't have a picture of Tom Murray, but this is a man from the same unit. This is the 17th Virginia. Tom Murray Jr. had been born Fairfax Courthouse. in 1843. And when the war began, he was an 18-year-old student attending Georgetown University. That summer, he enlisted in the 17th Virginia, which would eventually become part of Pickett's division. He served with that unit until 64, when he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 1st Battalion Virginia Infantry. He was at Appomattox, made his way there. And if any of you have ever done work in the compiled service records, you don't have the parole pass that the men carried home with them. You might be able to find out whether the soldier that you're looking for was indeed at Appomattox, of his name in his compiled service record. And so we know that Murray was in fact paroled at Appomattox. Remember, he's now with the 1st Battalion Virginia Infantry, but he's going to go find some of his old comrades from the 17th Virginia to try to make his way back to Fairfax. He's one of those men who is fortunate enough to find a dilapidated old broken down horse on which to travel. And so the group of men, about 5 or 6 of them, they're going to take turns riding this poor horse as they head north along the route that's been sketched out here for you. April had been incredibly rainy. There were lots of swollen creeks and rivers, muddy roads. They talk about having to ford these swollen streams. They camped in bushes along the roadside when they couldn't find houses to stay in. But only a day's ride from home, Tom's fortunes turned for the worse. They had reached the outskirts of Warrenton in Fauquier County when they got word of Lincoln's assassination. And they heard that federal troops in Warrenton were incredibly angry. This is also John Mosby's territory, and Mosby at this point was refusing to surrender. And so this is also animating conversation. Murray's comrades urge him, just stay put. You don't need to make it home. Let's figure out what to do. That's what they're going to do. They're going to hang low, just wait. But Murray has just gotten word, and we could also have a conversation about how information is traveling during all of this. He's just gotten word that his father has died. And so he desperately wants to make his way home to his mother. He's confident that parole pass that he's carrying will protect him. He pulls it out. He shows his comrades and says, look, I can make my way home with this. He says, Grant has promised as much. But the other thing that's going on here is that there is a manhunt for Lincoln's murderers. And Union soldiers stationed just south of the Washington defenses had decided that they did not have to abide by honoring those parole passes. As he tries to make his way through into Fairfax County, he is immediately placed under guard. He is escorted to a provost marshal's office. Pleading that he had just learned of his father's death, he begged to go home. We're 2 sympathetic members of the provost guard. They say, okay, we'll let you go home for 1 evening, but you are going to remain under guard. Remember, you are a prisoner of war. So he was escorted to his mother's home, allowed to spend 1 evening. And the following morning, the US soldiers returned, carting Murray off on a bumpy and jarring ride in a lumber wagon, making their way to Fairfax Station, where they placed him and other captured Confederates on a train bound for Alexandria. More bad news awaits Murray upon his arrival in Alexandria. Despite his parole and despite the parole pass that he had, he and others are carted before the acting provost marshal, where their names were recorded and his pass from Appomattox ripped in 2. From there, the Union Guards marched the group to a large room, confined them. He looks around as his eyes adjust to the dark, realizes there's about 200 to 300 other Confederates in the room, many of them members of the 17th Virginia, so local boys, men who had likewise been trying to make their way home. And as he's taking all of this in, again, as his eyes are adjusting to the darkness, he realizes that they've been taken to a military prison. He knows exactly where they are. They're being held in the Price, Birch and Company slave jail on Duke Street, one of the largest and most notorious slave markets in the country. The son of a Fairfax attorney who owned 7 slaves in 1860, Murray and his fellow Confederates could not have escaped the irony. Men who had gone off to war to protect their slaveholding nation now found themselves confined in the very pens where they had previously traded in flesh. This is all a reminder that they are still prisoners of war, of the uncertainty of what it would mean to be a Confederate after the war ended. Directing all the commissioned officers to arrange themselves in line, a U.S. sergeant stepped forward with a pair of scissors. One by one, he snipped the brass buttons from their uniforms or the bars and stars from their collars. Stripped of their rank and proof that they had remained with Lee's army to the end because those parole passes have been torn up, Murray and his comrades were sent home, released, sent to their homes under guard. But again, they're still prisoners of war. And if you look at the Alexandria Gazette, in the weeks after the surrendered Appomattox, you will see lists like this of paroled prisoners. You see Tom Murray's name here. Every day, the newspaper would list all of those who had come home, men who were still deemed a threat to the community. Murray and the 75,000 other Confederates who had homes in so-called loyal territory. So here I'm including the region around Washington, D.C. that had been occupied, so-called loyal Virginia and Alexandria, but also the loyal border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland. West Virginia has its own unique issues going on I'd be happy to talk about. But 75,000 Confederates came from states that had remained loyal to the Union. And they would face many challenges, including a decree by both Grant and by the Attorney General that they could not return to their homes if they had fought for the Confederacy. And it's not just that Grant and Speed say that they can't return to their homes. In some counties in Maryland, the counties that you see here with the horizontal lines, there are vigilance committees that are set up to make sure that Confederates do not return to their homes, to run them out, to tar and feather them, as happened on some instances. Same thing happens in West Virginia, even though for a host of reasons, Grant and Speed have said that soldiers should be able to return to West Virginia because it was part of Virginia when the war started. In these counties, and I'm convinced that there are more counties, I just happened to find these by finding reference in newspapers to vigilance committees. It's not just that men are being prevented from coming back to those counties. There are several instances in which men are shot and killed for coming back to these communities. All of this to say, the story of their war had not ended on April 9th or April 12th at Appomattox. Confederates moving across the South in the days, weeks, and indeed even the months after Appomattox witnessed a world far removed from the one they had pledged to defend in 1861. So did African Americans. One former slave from Alabama recalled watching Confederates leave for war laughing and gay. They had departed for the war singing Dixie, he said, certain they were going to win. But now they returned skin and bones, their eyes hollow, their clothes ragged. In occupied Charleston, members of the 54th Massachusetts took notice as well. Here's what one soldier had to say. From the paroled armies of the defunct Confederacy came large numbers of soldiers in dilapidated garments and emaciated physical condition. Their destitution was so great, this soldier noted, they were glad to share the rations of our colored soldiers. I would suggest that most of these men felt otherwise. Now, there were hundreds of enslaved men that were still with Lee's army at Appomattox. And they too had a decision to make. How would they make their way home to their families? Edward Bogan, for example, of North Carolina, was one man who decided that he should travel with his master to make his way home. He decided this was the safest way to do that. But there are many others who strike out on their own. Nowhere was the new order of the world more apparent than in Confederate soldiers' encounters with United States colored troops. For example, on April 26th, the Wilmington, a steamer, steamed into the Savannah port with 690 paroled Confederates aboard, including a group of Floridians, one of which was named David Gear. They claim Gear is another one that left an account of his post-Appomattox time, and he claimed that they had already killed 2 Black soldiers back in Virginia. But while awaiting a second steamer that would carry them from Savannah to Jacksonville, a Black sentinel had reportedly stomped out their campfire. And enraged, they plotted his execution. They used a surgeon's knife. They slashed his throat and tossed him and the evidence of it in the river. When white officers grew suspicious about the missing soldier, Gear and 63 other Florida soldiers still awaiting steamers fled in the middle of the night, traveling overland rather than risking further inquiries. For a third time since leaving Appomattox, they had killed Black soldiers and gotten away with it. Other interactions with Black soldiers proved less deadly, but no less revealing of how much the social order had changed. At Selma, Alabama, U.S. soldiers ordered members of Hood's Texas Brigade to disembark from a train so that the United States colored troop soldiers could travel. Several days later, at New Orleans, the Texans found themselves guarded by a group of United States colored troop soldiers, a slight that Captain W.T. Hill of the 5th Texas believed to be intentionally demeaning. More humiliating for members of Hood's brigade, the Black soldiers had taken to cutting the Confederates' buttons off their coats. Hill observed, quote, "The Texans were quick to catch on, and by cutting off our own brass buttons, denied them the great satisfaction of doing so." Indeed, in the wake of surrender, Black soldiers guarding paroled Confederates, cutting buttons off their coats, taking precedence in travel, embodied the world turned upside down. The presence of Black men in uniforms, perhaps even more than the surrender itself, represented the death of the Confederacy. Again, there are so many more stories that I could share, but I'd like to leave you with this. Rather than serving as a clear ending to the war, the surrender of Lee's army and their trek home brought into stark relief many of the legal, of the social, of the political questions that had animated the war from the beginning. Perhaps most important, there had never been a golden moment when Lee's soldiers, or even their civilian supporters, had been so thoroughly whipped they were willing to accept any conditions. For Confederate soldiers and their civilian supporters, surrendering to Union forces did not mean admitting that their cause was wrong. As the Shenandoah Valley newspaper assured its readers on April 21st, 1865, General Lee surrendered not rights of conscience, no sentiment or feeling of affection for his country. We are still proud of our country, I, if possible, prouder than ever, and still love it with a devotion intensified by her misfortune. As you can imagine, these references to our country just infuriate white Northerners. But if anything, the humiliation of registering at provost marshal's offices, of being detained by Union troops, of having buttons and insignia removed, the presence of Black and white occupying troops, indeed the very trip home itself, emboldened the claims of Southern righteousness and Northern barbarity. The disbanding of Lee's army had not marked the end of the nation's division. It was only the beginning, foreshadowing much of what would play out in the decades and perhaps even longer to come. Thank you.
So we have 10 to 15 minutes for questions.
Yes, sir.
We spoke earlier, I was going to ask you a question about why you were going to do history, but looking through your book, I was hugely impressed by your endnotes. And when I say that, this is an academic book, as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm asking you, because you are an educator first, what motivated you to write 9, 10 books with, I'm sure, the same academic rigor as this book? Because this is an immense, going back to look back at this, the references are as good as any scientific paper that I've read.
Well, thank you.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about why not only were you interested in history, but the immense amount of effort multiple times for writing these books. Thank you.
It's a lot of great big questions. So how did I become interested in history? I casually say, but it's true that I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley, surrounded by history. You throw a rock in any direction, and I was intrigued by that. Also, I credit my family for asking those questions in me. My grandfather was a Marine in World War II, was at Iwo Jima and Saipan, and was an avid reader of Civil War history. Never, ever talked to me about his wartime experiences, but took me to Antietam and Gettysburg for the first time. And he would walk the fields. As someone who's studied veterans a lot now, I wish I could have those conversations with him now about what he was thinking when he walked those fields, but he never ever talked to me about what that meant to him. But he did instill in me an appreciation for not just the past, but trying to understand why people did what they did in the past. And my parents took us to Mount Vernon and to Monticello and Jamestown. We did those sorts of things. My mom was a 5th grade history teacher. So in some ways, I don't see how I had any other choice. I was on my way to law school, and then I had a professor as an undergrad in a pass-fail class. You may have heard of him. I don't know. He's not that famous. His name's Ed Ayers. He changed my world. So that's why I decided, blissfully ignorant of the academic job market, to become a historian. But the research itself, I love every part of it. I love teaching. I love being in an undergrad classroom. I love researching. I love being in the archives. I love putting the pieces together, figuring out, trying to understand people on their own terms, and trying to approach the past, not by saying these are good guys and bad guys, and I'm condemning or condoning, but what motivated people to do the things that they did, to say the things that they said. And so I'm an archives rat. I love that part. I also love the writing part. So it's questions. I'm motivated by questions and trying to understand. Go in the back of the room.
Oh, I have a number of friends from my high school who went to Washington and Lee University. And I have a great sense of pride in that university. But when Robert E. Lee, in October of 1865, became president of Washington College, it's my impression that it was on the brink of closing. And he saved it.
His reputation absolutely did.
Okay.
Absolutely.
He recruited students from all over. And of course, when he died, they changed the name. Anyway, the fact that it was on the brink.
That's my understanding. I mean, I'm not a historian of that institution, but his reputation certainly helped with that.
Now, the other real quick thing. He immediately after the surrender, there's a bill standing in Richmond next to the state capitol, St. Paul's Church. And he went to St. Paul's Church on Sunday after the surrender. And when it came time for the communion, there were blacks in attendance, and they went up to take communion. And my understanding that he joined them at the altar to demonstrate that you could wasn't wrong to take communion with previous wife. Are you familiar with that story?
I don't know about the veracity of that story or not. I mean, I've certainly heard the story, the veracity of it, though. I'm not sure. Yes, sir.
We're from, we look at.
Oh, okay.
Was it just Appomattox that got because.
The parole pass?
The parole pass, because these guys are, not these guys, but the lookout prisoners, if they chose, even before the war ended, to be paroled.
Oh, of course,
Is that
yes.
the same kind of parole though?
It
means the same thing.
yes, in the short version. So the parole pass that you see from Appomattox is unique in that it was printed in the field. One of the 4 commanders in the Army of the Potomac had a printing press with him, which is how you print off orders. And so those are printed in the field, but another part of this story is that one of the things that Grant does is he authorizes the paroling of those 20,000 men that I mentioned that didn't surrender at Appomattox. He authorizes that they can be paroled wherever they turn themselves in. So there are provost marshal's offices all over the place, including in King George County, where you can go to the provost marshal and get paroled. And those passes actually look like the passes from places where you can look at. They include much more detailed information. They include height, eye color, hair color. So Winchester, Virginia, for example, lots and lots of soldiers are paroled at Winchester. In fact, in my book, there's a map that will show you some of the different locales in Virginia and Maryland and North Carolina where Army of Northern Virginia soldiers were paroled. The Winchester is a great example that they look like the parole passes from a prisoner of war camp they were a form and they're being filled in, as opposed to the one that is created in the field at Appomattox. And that's what makes those Appomattox passes so unique. And now I've come to understand that they're even more valuable in the sense that I had no idea how many of them were actively destroyed by Union provost marshals in the weeks and months after the war. And so men will lament, many of them will hold on to them for the rest of their lives. You also find the opposite thing where men will swear that they're an unreconstructed Confederate, that they've never surrendered, they've never been paroled, and then you find that they are listed on the parole passes, or the parole list rather. Yes, sir.
Were they receiving pay from the Confederate Army through the surrender? Did they have any money in their pockets? Have you read about any of that?
Very few of them have. I mean, some of them do have cash, have Confederate money. Very, very few of them do at this point, and they haven't been paid for, I don't know how many weeks it is at this point, but I don't even know if they've been paid since February of '65. So they are hard pressed. And who, the man who refuses to take Confederate money, can you blame him at this point?
And the wealthier officers, is their story different? Are they going to friends' homes in the larger cities to stay a little bit and write to the families? What's happening there?
So a lot of them are they're going on their own. One of the provisions that Grant allows is that officers in their baggage, so their wagons, can go with them. And so you have Longstreet and Pendleton, and who am I forgetting? And Gordon, who are the 3 commissioners for Virginia, for the Army of Northern Virginia, that stay behind. They stay in Appomattox for an extra couple of days, extra 2 days, to work out the actual details of what the surrender will look like and the dispersal of the army. And there are stories about, Longstreet is going to go to Richmond, and then he's going to make his way slowly, eventually to Texas. But they all have their baggage with them. There's a great story of a group of soldiers that show up at some woman's house, and Pickett is with them. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pickett, but there's the story that Lee at one point says, is that man is still with the Army after Sailor's Creek and his bungling at Sailor's Creek. And there's a woman who turns them all away. And Pickett's like, but I'm Pickett. And she said, I don't care. You're not staying here. So again, there's as many different stories. Some officers, like Grimes, stay with their men. Most of them don't.
just like to, about Washington Williams, at the bookstore, or at the gift shop here, there was a book, I think it's called Lee, The Final Years of the Last Years. It describes it in detail. Highly recommend it in addition volumes. But the point is that, it gives a really, really good narrative of what happened, almost a Debbie Outback. And, very interesting about the honor of the man. And worth reading, if you and colleagues have changed.
Yes, ma'am.
The diaries, do they number in hundreds or thousands or?
So I wish I could give you a number off the top of my head. I created a spreadsheet for every state that the Confederate soldiers were from, and that included Maryland. I don't think I had anybody from Missouri. And I had several hundred firsthand accounts of those leaving, and those are the ones that I found. I relied, for those accounts, I relied primarily on diaries, but there are some letters and there are some memoirs that talk about the trip home, but very few. I mean, most soldiers quit writing on their way home. But there's much more testimony about it than I thought. This started as what I thought would be an article. And it was an article, and of course it kept ballooning because I kept finding more and more stuff. All right, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.